I've been working on this small side project and I've learned a few cool new things, so I want to share them with you. So in this video, we'll be talking about GraphQL and specifically GitHub's GraphQL API. We're also going to be taking a quick look at remix.run, and also I want to show you some cool things about GitHub CoPilot. So let's get in. So this is a kind of a small dashboard that takes data from the GitHub API and it calculates some metrics about the project. So I started by looking at pull requests, and you can see we're looking at the React repo right now. And you can see pull requests divided by month. And for each pull request, for each month, we can see the average time to pick up, which is how long it took from the moment the pull request was open until someone started reviewing it. Time to approve is how long the actual review took from start of review until approving. And time to merge, which is the total time from when the pull request was opened until it was merged. I also added a small calculation of the percent of test files out of all of the files. So from the all files in the pull request, what percent were test files? I'll start with the GraphQL part. This was my first time working with a GraphQL API. I've worked with GraphQL on Gatsby projects, but not with like an actual GraphQL endpoint. So I chose to use a library called GraphQL Request. It was like the simplest one that I could find. And basically what you do with the library is you create a GraphQL client, you supply the endpoint. This is the endpoint for the GitHub GraphQL API, and you supply a token. So they have a tutorial explaining how to create this token. And once we do that, we create a request. So we pass a query to this request, which we'll be looking at in a second, and we pass variables. So in our case, the variables are the cursor. We're going to talk about that a bit later, but that's used for pagination. And we're also passing the repository info, in this case, the owner and the name. Right now, we're looking at React by Facebook. Query is defined inside this GQL helper, which gets template literal, and this is where we define our query. So you can see these are the variables that we passed in, and we use them here and here. And basically we're querying the repository object, and under that we're requesting the pull requests from it. We're defining a few filters and how many to fetch and how to sort them. And then we start getting some info about the actual pull requests, which are the nodes. So you can see this node is of type array of pull request. And then we can query fields about the pull request. So something very cool here is that we have Typescript autocompletion suggestions for everything. So we can like see all the fields of each object that we want to add. And like, let's say I want to add some data about the files. So it already knows like the type of nested objects and like the reviews. So we can see that it's a connection also, and it has nodes, and then we see each field on the review nodes. And how does this TypeScript magic happen? So let me show you that. Okay, so to get this auto-completion working, what we need is two things. First one is the GraphQL official VS Code extension. And the second one is I downloaded the schema for this specific GraphQL endpoint. So I downloaded it from GitHub. They basically provide the schema for this GraphQL endpoint. And if we look at it, it's like just everything that this endpoint includes. It's a huge file, and we put it in the root, and that's how we know how all this autocomplete. I think you can also retrieve this like by fetching it, but I didn't look into that, so I just put the file hard-coded in my folder. A bit about Remix. We're not going to be going very deep into Remix because I barely scratched the surface here in this project. But I wanted an opportunity to kind of play around with it, and I did see a few cool stuff that I want to share with you. What we're seeing right now is our index file, which represents the index route. Remix has these file-based routes like in Next.js. So you can see under the routes folder, we have the index file. And Remix is a framework that helps us server-side render React apps. And I want to show you two parts of this file. The first one is the loader, which is what gets run on the server. And the second one is the actual component, which is what gets rendered. And the loader, so the loader, it receives the request and it can do things with the request if it needs to. Like in our case, I'm taking the URL parameter called cursor from the request because I'm using that for pagination. And then this is the place where we can fetch data and basically return a response to the client. So I have this get response function. Basically what it does is it just transforms and extracts the data that I want to send to the client side, which is used to render the graphs. And the way I type this, so I want to show you how I typed it in Typescript. So I defined a response type, and I defined it as the return type of this function. So the way it looks like is basically it infers what this function is returning, and that's the type. And if I'll add in the future anything to this function, then that will automatically be inferred and added to this response type. So I'm using this response type here for what I'm returning. Okay, so this is the component part that we're rendering, and the way that it gets the data from the loader is with a hook called useLoaderData. This is a Remix hook, and I'm using the type that I defined to basically have data be typed, so I know what it has on it. The thing I want to talk about is this pagination component because it shows us a couple of nice Remix features. So the way it behaves, basically the GitHub API, it limits us to a certain number of objects we can fetch. So we need to paginate between them. So when I click next, it's going to render the next page straight away. But the next time I click it, it's going to show us a loading. And we'll see why that happens in a second. Okay, so first time it loaded it straight away. Second time it showed us this loading. Let's see how this is created. This is how this pagination component looks like. So first of all, I wanted to explain the pagination in the GitHub API. So basically we get a page info on our response, and page info, it's of type page info, by the way. I'm typing it using a library GitHub provides with the GraphQL schema. So this is not the same way the GraphQL API is typed, but these are the same types, and I'm using them to type the props. So a page info, it includes these props, has next page, has previous page, and the start and end cursor. So basically I can know whether I have a previous or next page, and I can fetch them by the start or end cursor, which I'm adding to the URL as parameters. So first thing I want to show you was that loading state that we saw when we clicked the next button. So this is implemented using the useTransition hook. So useTransition is a hook from Remix, not to be confused with React's useTransition hook that they introduced in React 18. So there's like a naming conflict there, and Remix are actually going to be changing this hook to be called useNavigation. But what useTransition does is returns everything you need to know about a page transition to build pending navigation indicators and optimistic UIs. So what I'm using here is the state, and the state is either loading or idle, or there's a few states, idle, submitting, or loading. And I'm checking if we're in the loading state, and I'm using that to show the loader. So that's pretty straightforward. And the second cool thing I wanted to show you is the prefetch. Okay, so just before I show the prefetch prop, I wanted to say that if you're wondering what all these class names are, so this is Tailwind CSS that I'm using here. I have a lot of videos of me going over Tailwind CSS in the YouTube channel, so feel free to check them out. So what is prefetch? We've got this link component, which comes from remix.run React, and it has a prop called prefetch, which has a few options. So we can prefetch none, which means it just won't prefetch the data. And we can prefetch on render, and we can prefetch on intent. So I'm using prefetch on render. So first of all, what does it prefetch? It prefetches the path that I'm passing here, and the path is just like to the loader with the parameter of cursor, which like that's the next batch of data. So prefetching on render means that once the component is rendered, it's going to start prefetching. And the other option is intent, which means that Remix can identify my intent. So if I'm hovering close to the link or hovering on the link, then it will start prefetching. So that's really cool. And that's why at first, when I was clicking, the data was already prefetched. So it rendered it immediately. And the second time I clicked straight away, it didn't have time to prefetch, and it showed us the loading spinner. To finish up, I wanted to talk a bit about GitHub CoPilot. So I've been using GitHub CoPilot for a long time, and it's kind of, they call it your AI pair programmer, something like that. And basically, it kind of offers you suggestions to write the code for you. And a lot of these functions here, so this is like the data utils file. It has functions like get the average PR times and get like PRs by month and all these kind of utility functions. And these are kind of simple functions, and I just wrote basically the title for each of them, and GitHub Copilot wrote them pretty much for me, and that's really amazing. So I wanted to finish up with some GitHub Copilot live coding. So let's do that. So I want to add like another metric to my dashboard. Not necessarily something I'd really add, but something that could be nice for this demo. So let's add export function top PR reviewers. Okay, so this is GitHub Copilot suggesting how to implement this function. So I'm just going to accept his suggestion blindly. So basically, it accepts a pull request array, and then it goes over it. It gets the reviewers, it gets the author, and then it counts how many times this author appears. And then it takes the keys of this object, it sorts them by the number, and returns the top 5. So looks good. I didn't rehearse this for real. This is like the first time that I'm writing this. So this is the function, and now let's add this function to our data. So I can go to get response, and I'll add top code reviewers. So let's get our function. We called it, okay, we called it top PR reviewers, and we'll pass it the PRs. Okay, so now that we have that, we can create the component to render that. So let's create top PR reviewers. And this will accept, it will accept reviewers. I think it was just like a string array. Okay, so let's take their suggestion again without really looking at it. Looks pretty good. And then let's render that. Let's add that here. So top PR reviewers, and we'll add reviewers. Okay, and let's see how that looks like. Okay, so looks like it works. That's pretty cool. Just my pagination got cut off, but so we've got our top 5 code reviewers. Yeah, and if we're paginating, we can see this change. So we can basically see the top PR reviewers for this for these specific PRs. So that was, I think, a nice demo of what GitHub Copilot can do, and it's very cool. I use it a lot, and it saves me a ton of time. So I recommend, if you haven't tried it out yet, there's like a 3-month free period. So definitely try that out. That's going to be it for today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found it useful. This is my website, so that's ubicloud.dev. If you want to find me on any of the social networks and hit me up, feel free. Bye bye.